Hello, welcome back to The Independent Pianist, and I'm your host, Cole Anderson, as always. And today I'm doing something a little bit different from the usual. I got a number of requests recently to talk about the equipment that I use to make my performance videos. In fact, I've been getting requests like that for quite some time, almost since the channel started. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about what my setup is, the equipment that I use, what the upsides are to what I'm using, and also drawbacks. So first off, it should probably be obvious to most people who are watching this channel that I'm not making my recordings on an acoustic piano. I don't know necessarily if this is obvious or not though for everyone, because the equipment that I do have gives a very high degree of verisimilitude. So here's the instrument that I'm using for my keyboard. This is a Kawai Virtual Piano Controller 1, and it's really a marvelous instrument. I couldn't be more happy with it. It's a very important thing to consider if you're thinking about buying something like this. This keyboard does not make any sounds by itself. It does not have a built-in sound library like many Yamahas or Roland electric pianos. Only a keyboard, so you have to run it through a computer and some kind of sound library, some kind of virtual instrument in order to actually get sound. That being said, the action on this piano is magnificent. It actually contains a real-life Kawai action, just like they have on their acoustic pianos inside, so it's extremely lifelike to play. I won't say it's exactly the same as playing on an acoustic piano. There's a very slight difference in the feeling of the touch, but it's almost exactly the same. And it's probably the closest you're going to get outside of playing an acoustic piano. One other thing to keep in mind about this piano, the action is quite heavy. So you have to be prepared for that. Kawai in general is well known for building pianos that tend to have heavy actions, and that's something I've always kind of liked about them. Kawai is never my first choice when it comes to performing pianos, I'm sorry to say, but for practicing, I find their instruments to be almost ideal. The slightly stiffer action and very clear sound leads to a great deal of control when you're actually playing on a real performance instrument. Usually those big 9-foot pianos like a Steinway D or something like that, or a Busendorfer Imperial, they're so well made and so efficiently made, they tend to have a very light, easy action to deal with. So that was a great thing when I made this transition to using the Kawai for virtually all of my practicing. I actually found that my technical security when I was performing improved a lot because I had this kind of solidity of technique built up from using this really stiff piano. So of course there is the drawback to that, which is if you're trying to record using this piano, which of course I do record using it, you might run into issues where it's a little bit more difficult to attain faster tempi just by nature of the action being a bit stiffer and slower to respond. So I have found that to be a little bit of a problem, but over time I've begun to adjust to it and I'm able to play and attain faster tempi when I need to. However, if you are looking for a piano which is a little bit lighter, there are options. Just about any electric piano made nowadays will connect into a computer if you want to use a virtual instrument like I'm using. So if you have a Yamaha electric or a Roland electric, those pianos also can be used for the same purpose. And many of those models also have excellent built-in real actions, just like this Kawai does. Nonetheless, I find the Kawai to just feel so good, and it gives me such an advantage in real acoustic performance that I wouldn't trade it for anything. Maybe the ideal situation would be to have a keyboard which is actually a little lighter to make recordings on and then practice on the Kawai. Now, of course, there is a little bit of a stigma against using electric pianos, especially in the acoustic piano world, in the classical piano world. There's kind of an idea that they're not real pianos, that they don't give you the same kind of effect as using a real piano. And that's true in many respects. It used to be very much true as regards the action. Older electric pianos had a much less lifelike action, so you really didn't get the same kind of physical training. And that they were fine to use if you were already an experienced pianist, but if you were trying to build up technique and develop your playing, then maybe they weren't ideal. Nowadays, that's far less the case because modern models of electric piano just have far better, more lifelike actions. But actually, I think even the stigma against the sound of the electric piano is a little bit misplaced in some ways. Now, of course, using an electric piano or a virtual piano controller with a virtual instrument the way I'm using is not going to replace using an acoustic piano. There are too many subtleties, especially subtleties with pedaling, which don't come across in exactly the same way. And of course, nothing could replace the magic of playing a really beautiful physical piano in a beautiful space. However, there are some ways in which it's actually an advantage to practice on one of these instruments, and I can name a few of them right off the top of my head. First off, the whole reason why I got into using this piano in the first place was because my neighbors were complaining a lot about my practicing. So during COVID in 2020, when I started this channel, I had an acoustic piano where I lived, and I was practicing all day long. I was stuck inside, so I was practicing 4 or 5 hours a day on this piano. I couldn't go to a music school. Usually I would practice at the local music school, but I wasn't able to do that. So I started to get a lot of complaints from neighbors who were also having to work from home and have to put up with my piano practicing. And I can totally understand that, because there's a lot of kind of nitty-gritty technical practicing that you have to do if you're a serious classical pianist. And that's not very pleasant to listen to, really, for most people. So luckily, though, my mom came up with the idea. I was telling her about this problem I was having, and she came up with the idea of getting this piano, which she did. She got it for me. So it's all thanks to her that I'm actually doing this channel now and have made all these recordings. And of course, that immediately removed the whole problem of neighbors complaining, because I always just practice with my headphones on. But beyond that, though, there was another striking advantage to it. I noticed that when I got a virtual instrument, a really nice virtual instrument, the virtual instrument gives you an impression of what it's like to actually play a really great piano in a great space. A really good virtual instrument tends to be highly customizable. So the one that I'm using is the American Concert D by Ivory 2. It's put out by the company called Synthogy. So this is an American Concert D piano, Steinway piano that's been sampled, and it has samples for the soft pedal. It has half pedal effects as well that you can get. And more importantly, you can customize the sound a great deal. So you can customize exactly what the timbre is. You can customize the tuning. You can customize the reverb and what the space sounds like that you are playing in virtually. So I noticed a lot of really wonderful things happening to my playing when I started practicing on the virtual instrument. I discovered that I started to get a feel for the kind of timing that I would need when I was in a large space. Oftentimes my problem would be that I'd be practicing in little teeny practice rooms on these big pianos that would be really, really loud, and you don't get the same kind of effect as when you're in a concert hall. You don't get reverb, you don't get any of that stuff. When you're in a large space, you have to instinctively adjust for the reverb, for how long it takes for the sound to reach the audience, for the greater kind of clarity you sometimes need to put into your playing in order for everything to be heard in the same way that you're hearing it from the stage. Oftentimes you need to play a little slower, a little bit more clearly in your articulation than you would in a teeny little room. And I think that's actually a problem for a lot of students. A lot of students spend so much of their time practicing in practice rooms, and then they're just absolutely thrown off when they get into a big hall. And that's even the case if you get to practice in the hall once in a while. It's oftentimes not quite enough just playing for a weekly studio class or something like that. It's not always enough to really get a feeling for what it's like to be performing in a hall all the time. So that was an advantage actually to using this. I really started to get a feeling for what I would need to do when I would get into an actual space. Then I noticed also that I became much more confident about my practicing, much more confident to just try things and do things. I think by nature I'm a little bit of a shy person and a little bit of a self-conscious person. So when I was in music school, where there's always a million other pianists around you practicing, you can hear them practicing, so you can kind of subconsciously compare yourself to them, and maybe you feel that they're sometimes listening to you and criticizing what you're doing. Obviously, there's a good qualities to that because you can exchange ideas with other pianists, you can hear what other people are doing, and so forth. But at the same time, it can be a little paralyzing for people who are, in essence, introverts. And I know I've heard many famous pianists actually complain about the difficulty of practicing in front of people, like the renowned Stephen Hough, who's one of the most famous pianists in the world today. He has said many times that he can't practice if people are listening. And it became a real problem for him when he was on tour, because people would always want to listen to his practicing if he went to someone's house to practice, for example, and he just couldn't really do it. And he ended up actually getting an electric piano that he takes around with him so that he can practice a little bit here and there in hotel rooms before concerts, just to get a little extra polishing in. So when someone like that is actually jumping on the electric piano train, it should give you pause before you start to just write them off as being unnatural and unsuited for classical pianists to use at any time. I think they're a very useful tool, and they can be very handy in the right context. Now, having said that, they cannot completely replace an acoustic piano. So if you're going to be using a piano like this to practice for the majority of your time, I think it would be very useful to find some way to get yourself time in front of a real piano. Number one thing that you need at a real piano to practice is accurate pedaling, because I noticed that the pedaling on an instrument like this, it's not quite the same, even though they've tried to make it as close as possible. And maybe someday they'll get the advances to actually mimic all of the little gradations and subtleties of quarter, half, three-quarter pedaling that you can do on a real piano, but they're not quite there yet. So in the Synthogy Ivory 2 program that I have, they do have a half pedal function, but that's all there is. There's a certain point at which you get kind of a half dampening of the sound, but you can't do these really subtle gradations of pedal. So you have to find ways to get those effects on this instrument when you're recording, and it is possible to do oftentimes, but sometimes you have to substitute other effects that are slightly different than what you do if you had a real piano at your disposal. So that is a little bit of a drawback. The good news is that practicing on a piano like this, especially this Kawai, your fingers are going to feel absolutely supercharged when you actually practice on a real instrument. You're not going to have that sensation that your fingers are really weak and that you can't play really well. It really sets you up very, very well for practicing on an actual instrument, an acoustic instrument, I should say. So yeah, I actually think that this is a useful tool for practically any performing musician. The obvious advantage of being able to record yourself without needing expensive microphones or large recording setups, an actual studio space, for example, is enormous. You can actually record yourself, hear what you're doing, hear where your weaknesses are, and actually being able to examine the MIDI data that you create when you record is also quite interesting. I actually found that I was able to pinpoint many of the weaknesses in my playing, many little unevennesses that I had, or things that I just wasn't picking up on by just examining the MIDI data and seeing, where my technique might be a little weaker, where I'm not playing as evenly. You can also do things like slow down the recording very easily without changing the pitch. So you can hear little details and timing that otherwise might kind of pass you by, and that actually has an effect in the final performance. So I found it to be very, very interesting. Actually, editing is also pretty easy using these things. I've avoided doing very much of that because I want my performances to be as natural as possible. I have tailored the sound, I have added reverb and things like that. But for my video performances, I avoid going through and just like fixing notes and things like that. Occasionally I have to kind of even out a note here or there because there's kind of an odd thing on the Ivory 2 where certain notes will always be a little louder than other notes. They seem to be slightly uneven in the balancing. So I think that's just a weakness in the program. So maybe in the newer program, I know that Ivory just came out with Synthogy just came out with a new version of their Ivory, the Ivory 3. So maybe on that program you can actually fine-tune note by note. I know that would be something I'd love to do so that I could even out these little problems that are in the software. Because right now I have to go through and it's like the G sharp below middle C is always louder than all the other notes, and I have to go through and kind of even out the G sharps and things like that. But you could actually make a fully edited version of something and correct wrong notes and stuff fairly easily. And I'm actually planning to do that when I release a lot of these performances in audio-only versions. I'm planning to go through and kind of clean up a few little messy spots and things like that, which I just left in the videos for these performances. Yeah, so I hope you found this to be interesting and enlightening, so you know now exactly what I'm using to make these videos. And maybe this will be inspirational. Maybe someone out there will want to get something like this for their own practicing. I've actually found it to be a game changer for me. It's really led to an enormous amount of growth in my own playing, and now I really wouldn't trade it up. I'd love to have an acoustic piano in my home, if it were possible, just to try out pieces from time to time or to have rehearsals and things like that. At the moment, I don't have one, but maybe someday down the road, I'll get one. But even if I did have one, I still would keep my Kawai to practice on. I just really love it to bits and pieces now. So thanks for watching. Please stay tuned. Next week I'll be back with some more interesting conversation and music. Please do consider supporting the channel if you can. An easy way to do that is on patreon.com. And thank you to all my current Patreon supporters. It's so wonderful that you're there to support this effort that I'm making. I really couldn't do it without you, so I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And thank you to everyone who just watches and comments and subscribes and likes the videos. That's all really helpful too. I really enjoy getting to interact with all of you through the comment section, and always happy to hear that my content might be making a positive impact on people's lives. So thanks for all that. I'll see you next time. This is Cole Anderson signing off.